So shall I start right now?
Yes, you
Okay,
can.
great.
Well,
Well, thank you so much, Sabir, for hosting us at the Strand. We're just delighted. So I'll just say a few words about the book. I want to give credit to David Kuhn, whose literary agency, Avitas, is based in New York City. He was a colleague of mine in the Tina Brown years at the New Yorker, and he approached me because he knew I knew so many poets about putting this anthology together. And etymologically, the name of his agency, Avitas, is drawn from the Greek, and it means the time through which a person is living or a thing lasts. And it also connotes a bright constellation. So I don't know what could be more appropriate for this book. So I want to thank David and his dedicated staff, and also my editor at Knopf, Deborah Garrison. We put this book together beginning in March 26th. I reached out to 125 poets and asked them all to recommend other poets who might be writing poems at this time in response to the pandemic. So within weeks, I was corresponding with hundreds of poets. And by June 9th, we had 87 poems. And then over the summer, with the Black Lives Matter focus and so much attention, to, so much necessary reckoning going on, we added poems by Claudia Rankine and Jericho Brown, and by Sally Wen Mao, who's going to read her marvelous poem Batshit tonight. And all of that was for the hardcover, published in November, which has 107 poems. We had some serendipity because the poems are written by poets A to Z, from Julia Alvarez to Matthew Zabruder. There were sweet surprises along the way, poems by three people with the surname Phillips, one of them here tonight, Rowan Ricardo, and the others, Patrick and Carl. Two couples, Danielle Chapman and Chris Wyman, a father and daughter from New Orleans, Peter Cooley and Nicole Cooley, two doctors, several poets who've had the virus, and several who have suffered the loss of people dear to them through it. The poems range in tone and subject and mood, from the jaunty to the seriously grave. And this was remarked on in a very heartening piece recently in the New Yorker Online, in the page turner section, a piece by Claire Bucknell. It's kind of amazing, but also predictable, that the magazine would find someone who's been studying the history, the role, and the significance of anthologies throughout the centuries. So she wrote that etymologically, anthology refers to a collection of flowers, varied species of blooms selected and arranged so that they look like they belong together. And since the term's origin in the 17th century, multiplicity has always been the form's coherent selling point, the provision in one volume of very different voices and concerns that nonetheless have some kind of collective force. And she concluded that what anthologies offer is the historical moments seen long-sightedly from many directions, a collective account of the times that's more considered, more patient, and more productively ambiguous than other kinds of record can manage. Truth-telling comes in many forms. I'll just say one more thing about the title, which is drawn from a poem by Pablo Neruda, and the translation is by Alistair Reid. The poem is titled Keeping Quiet. For once on the face of the earth, let's not speak in any language. Let's stop for 1 second. It would be an exotic moment, without rush, without engines. We would all be together in a sudden strangeness. And the poem concludes, perhaps the earth can teach us as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. So I think that's a very marvelous way to celebrate everything that happened this week. And now to the poets who are with us. And we're going to begin. Thank you everybody for joining us. And thank you again, Sabir. We're going to begin with Rachel Eliza Griffiths, who is a writer and a visual artist, one of my favorite photographers. Her most recent book of poems is Seeing the Body, and her new novel titled Promise is coming out in 2022 from Random House. Please welcome Rachel Eliza.
Hi, thank you so much, Alice. Thank you to the Strand. It's wonderful to be gathered in the company of poets whose work I love and admire. And I wish we were gathering to read poems that were for a more joyful occasion. This anthology is absolutely incredible. I have turned to it over and over in these last months. And thank you for inviting me to add my song to a much greater song. During this time, my own personal toll of family members and loved ones who didn't make it, whether they died on a ventilator or died in a way where they weren't held by family in any kind of ritual, is something that arrives in my morning thoughts each day. And I think poetry is a way to have a kind of vigil. And so now with 400,000 lives and rising kind of spread out beyond us, I can only hold to language and action and hope. This poem I'd like to read is called Flowers for Tanisha. I'd like to just read the dedication to her. I wrote this poem. It was the only poem I wrote in the spring, last spring. Usually that's a time that's very wild and fertile for me, not last spring in New York. But the contrast, the jarring kind of almost grotesque circumstances of spring blossoms and a silence in the city, and having gone through COVID-19 myself in March, and it being pretty scary actually, and still having some long-term effects from that illness stay with me. This poem is dedicated to Tanisha Brunson Malone, a forensic technician in New Jersey who places daffodils on body bags in the hospital's morgue and refrigerated trucks that hold as many as 38 bodies at the Hackensack University Medical Center. Flowers for Tanisha, Springtime, New York, 2020. Thank you for the daffodils you leave on the black lids of their bodies, each yellow prayer vibrant in its fading, each flower clinging to the flower of the body. New York, I can't bear your suffering while flowers burst. Oh, city of my bursting, of my heart. Oh, body of lonely flower and darker musicals of loneliness. New York, get up. Tanisha holds flowers in her arms. I can't afford to live without suffering. The city is coughing flowers. We come through the rough mercy of our bodies. We smile behind sky blue masks that make our voices taste sick and hurt. There's a man on 3rd Avenue singing into his hands where there is bread or birdsong or his mother's eyes. Maybe he is holding one of Tanisha's daffodils. And in this poem, his fever will not kill him. His song bursts like horns and hands and pots that roar each evening at 7 o'clock. New York of dreaming, New York of shining, Park Avenue, magnolias, don't go. Tanisha's gathering daffodils for body bags. New York, return and return. New York, ever and ever hours. I can't bear ghost of neon. I'll stand on 3rd Avenue singing to the sun, my face open and clean as the tears in Tanisha's eyes tell her to go home. I'll sing our city electric with my voice. I'll cry green rains O city of blossoming against dead flowers, New York, do not cry alone in your trains. Behind windows, hold joy, hold park and hospital, hold doctor and child, beloved in the unbroken mouth of our power, hold deli and rooftop and slow summertime in the river's trembling distance, hold coffee and crowds of angels sitting on village stoops and looking fine for no particular reason. O city of our bodies, heal and survive our hunger. O city, come laughing again inside of our dreams. New York, the world after you is now. I would like to believe this poem is a daffodil placed on the lid of a language that is trying to speak about the world. Let this poem be a stinging like beauty in our eyes. O city, we are living on our knees. Let Tanisha put her flowers down into the earth. New York, I want to save you. We who smile and block gardens of memory where life shines like water on green vines. We who love because we listen to the old song. We who love because we dance in our living rooms. We who risk ourselves by loving the faces we once touched in the name of life and remembered how to take the train home. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, Eliza. Thank you so much. Eliza Griswold is going to read next. She is a poet and a journalist, and her recent book of poems is titled If Men, Then. Eliza won the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for her nonfiction book, A Story of Families Coming Up Against the Oil and Gas Corporations. Is titled Amity and Prosperity, and she joins us from Philadelphia.
I'm so grateful to be here and so grateful to you, Alice, for making this beautiful book. And I've always wanted to see Rachel Eliza Griffiths because of the name Eliza. And so now I've gotten to. I'm just going to read and say first that, you know, I just feel so isolated so often. And so to do this tonight and to make community in this innovative way means more. It means a ton. And so does being a part of this book, because the book is a community. And I'm honored to be part of it. I'm honored to think that I deserve to be part of it. And to think that in some way I can make an offering to it. So here is 6 months from patient zero. Nothing is new. We fear one another without wanting to, uncertain who is salve and who is threat. Every honest answer is not yet. As avatars, we've grown more intimate. I prefer my avatar to me. Her lashes are longer, though people find her severe. A patient is a person who endures. To be patient is to be willing to endure, to forbear. Thank you.
Eliza, it's just such a perfect vessel.
Oh, fun.
Alexander Himan. His most recent book is My Parents, an Introduction. This Does Not Belong to You. He teaches at Princeton University. Welcome, Alexander.
Hello, everybody. I am new to all this. I normally write fiction and scripts, but in March, when the series of lockdowns started, and when Princeton students were sent home, I entered this hypomanic phase where I started writing poetry or more poetry and also making music because I didn't know what else to do. From my office at Princeton, where I've been spending months now, is very often the only person in the 7-story building. I can see the campus and it is totally empty. And it made me think it's quite post-apocalyptic very often, so that there's this structure without people in it. And so this is, it is great to see people on the screen, but it is never as good as actually seeing people and being in the same space with them. And we have some ways to go to get there. But in any case, it started me thinking about the fact that the world does not need us to exist. And so I remembered something that my father used to say. This poem is called The Future of Everything. There will be everything, my father used to say, except for us and our lives. This world will look the same trees, clouds, neighborhoods, and plains, but we will not be around to see any of it. This very home will have the same walls, except none of us will be sleeping within. There will be nothing inside these clothes. A vacant shirt and suit will stumble forth instead of me, instead of this aching body in search of memories to fill what's emptied. No one will remember us, not one will recall, because no future will ever notice we are gone. Give me your hand then, so I can hold it, my boy. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you. Yusef Komunyakaa has been working on a long poem for several years now, a poem called Requiem. And in March, he added some 40 lines to that poem, wove them into his beautiful composition. He isn't with us tonight. He wanted to be, but he can't be. And Grace Schulman is going to read those lines for us, the ones that are in the anthology. That's page 77, Grace.
Thank you. From Requiem. And already, legends ago, old growth has been lumbered and carted off wherever southern Pacific runs, and wavy marsh grasses ripped out, leaving a shadow of yellow fever and TB in rich, black, giving topsoil. And already a flotilla of Mardi Gras floats in early morning sunshine to undo days before, paint and glitter in an uproar. Bacchanalia hanging from eaves in the French Quarter. But then springs up a novel virus through our old racial memory, rolling back to the gray mounds of smallpox blankets torched by soldiers, ancestral loneliness working its way down through victims who were born talking rumors of war, always with arms around each other's shoulders to make sure they were not alone. Crossing memory's land bridge to another lonely side, and already the old wounds of desire return as heart trouble, sugar, blues, and second lining awakens a woeful eye.
Grace, thank you so, so much. And Yusef tapped in. Yusef, we're so happy you're here. And this gives us an opportunity, because I really often think the very best thing is to hear a poem twice. So would you be able to read that again for us, Yusef? Sabir? Let's see.
I think he may be having technical difficulties, as I've asked to turn on his video, but why don't we see if we can come back to him, and I will.
That's a good idea. Maybe we'll end with Yusef.
Yes.
Okay, let's do that. Yusef, if you're listening, we'll round back to you at the end. Now I'll introduce Sally Wen Mao, who is the author of 2 collections, Oculus and Mad Honey Symposium. She teaches at NYU and is joining us now from Las Vegas.
Hi, can Can you hear me?
Yes, I
okay.
can hear you.
Yes, so I am so thrilled to be a part of this. Thank you, Strand, for hosting this incredible group of poets. And thank you, Alice, for creating the vision for this project, for this anthology. Yes, I'm just really humbled to be among some of my favorite writers tonight. And I'll read my poem, Batshit, from the anthology. Say it to my face. Bat eater, blood poacher, carrier pigeon, germ carrier, carrion breath, China virus, filth, peril, pestilence, yellow jacket, yellow pest. My teeth of pangolin scales, my mouth of death. Just because I have a mask on doesn't mean I can't speak, doesn't mean I'm scared. Do you know how fast a virus kills a strong, healthy racehorse? In Australia, racehorses grazed on grass full of bat droppings. That's how hundreds of horses dropped dead and their trainers died too, from bat shit. It is a shame how people die like their animals, how some love foreign dogs more than foreign people. People petition against the lychee and dog meat festival in Yulin. They call eating dog barbaric, but not police brutality. They hate a caged animal in a foreign country, but ignore the border camps in their own. Listen, I love dogs too. Here I am, wishing I had one, quarantined and hogtied to solitude. When I go outside, I wear my sunglasses above my flu mask. It's not that I'm ashamed. Just last month, a woman was taking out the garbage in her tree-lined Brooklyn neighborhood, and someone waited to throw acid on her face, causing second-degree burns. The difference between a monster and a man's best friend is the difference between the lies you eat and the lies you refuse to accept. Like that time a man lied to me, I started crying and he called me hysterical, which meant batshit, which meant call me crazy, but bats signal good luck. In China, bats are a pun for blessing, good fortune. It's why emperors and common folk alike had all their household objects painted with clouds and flying bats, harbingers of another, better world. These creatures living upside down in perfect solitude, so still they are immortal. Stolen several times in its lifetime, an imperial familiar rose porcelain vase with a pattern of bats and peaches, dogs and lychees, sold at a Christie's auction for 20 million, enough to feed a village and supply its hospitals with N95 masks and respirators. In Wuhan, it is daybreak and the field hospitals are closing. For months, I worried about my family there, a city too far away to raise alarm. Here in my home, come April, some batshit people march against shelter in place, how worthless our bodies are to them, piling up in hallways and homes. In America, bats are a portent of death. In the parks under the sun, they swarm in broad daylight. Vampire bats do not eat pollen or fruit. They have heat sensors near their nose that smell the warmth of a racing heart. A single colony can drain 25 cows of blood. When you can't sleep, they hover near your pulse, hold your breath, turn on the lamp. Bathed in light, their wings flutter like heartbeats soon gone. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. You know, sometimes the poems call out to each other within the book, and the last lines of yours remind me of the last lines of Billy Collins' poem, Sequestration, about a couple in separate rooms. They sit in their separate rooms, guarding their own lives, two pilot lights flickering where their hearts used to be. Thank you, Sally, so much. Shane McCrae is my colleague at Columbia University's School of the Arts. He is the author of The Gilded Auction Block and Sometimes I Never Suffered. Welcome, Shane.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Sabir. Thank you, I know this cut off the beginning, but thank you, Alice and Sabir and everybody at the Strand. I'm really glad to be doing this reading. And I'm really, really glad to be part of this anthology. My poem is called I Hear the Wild Birds Singing Tangled Roads. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. I have opened a window in Manhattan twice as tall as it is wide, window on the 4th floor. In our sticker on the door, a sticker like the sticker on the door of a hotel room. I have opened a window in our. The sticker says it's fireproof. I have opened at the far end of our fireproof building in our fireproof apartment at the back that stretches from the middle of the building to the back, our building next to the big rock. So big you hadn't noticed it, our daughter, who next to me before had leaned not out, not through the screen, but to the edge of the window, leaned to the window, even pointed, not through the screen, but if I hadn't known she was pointing at the rock, I might have thought she was pointing at the screen and not the rock, but she was pointing at the rock. And when I told her, when I said the thing she was pointing at was a big rock, she looked at me like she was looking at a screen, like she had stopped to look at the thing she was supposed to look through. I had hoped she would look through me to see the thing I told her was the world, the big rock in it, but how long ago last week we stood in front of the rock, and she said she had never seen it or she had seen it, but had thought it was a road. The screen makes grids on things like land surveyors make. So big, it's not a natural part of the world. It's easier to think a will like hers, the will that made our building that stands where it stands, because it was 124 years ago, developers who didn't want to spend the money to blow up the rock. It's easier to think the will that makes the window makes the rock. It's 9:26, I have opened a window, I have stood at the screen at the window and only heard, I hear now only still birds, their songs clashing now and full of no one walking where before, of the gone people who before soaked up the singing. I hear the wild birds singing tangled roads. I see the rock that was a road. Thank you.
I've seen your daughter at that window for months now, Shane. So evocative. Thank you so much. Now we will welcome Eileen Myles from Marfa, Texas. She is a poet, novelist, memoirist, and art journalist. Her 22nd book, For Now, an essay on writing, was published in September from Yale University Press. Welcome, Eileen.
Okay. Thanks, Alice, and thanks everybody else. I mean, I love the impulse behind this book because it's there's no doubt that we all had this experience, and so there's something about it's a really good ground to meet on, and then the diversity of the book gets to be who we are and how we write. So it makes a really exciting meeting, and I'm glad to be in it. And I was trying to write. I was in Marfa when I wrote my poem, and it was early pandemic, and I was working on a novel that just made suddenly no sense whatsoever in the altered time of the pandemic. So it was I just was writing poems were just pouring out of me, and it was very much kind of an accounting, because I Marfa's a place that I kind of zoom in and out of since I've had a home here, and but I never just stayed, and I found that the nature and the place, all these things, Marfa was doing all these things that I didn't know it was doing because I stayed still, and so this poem really is just about being in it and walking down the street to a friend's birthday party and coming back, but I think it's really about enchantment. April 16, 2020. And the poem kept waiting for a rhyme and it never came, but I think that's the trick. Open the window to sunset, let the light in. That bird, that red. Elise is 40. The poverty of my house is I have no view, no mountains and dusk. I simply come in, having seen all that, and I open the window and it breathes me.
It's also such a poem of place, Eileen. You can feel that place. Thank you so much. Rowan Ricardo Phillips is joining us from Williamstown, Massachusetts. He's written a wonderful book about tennis, as well as 3 books of poems, The Ground, Heaven, and Living Weapon, all published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. He teaches now at Williams College. Welcome, Rowan.
Hi, Alice. Hi, everyone. Welcome and greetings from snowy Williamstown, Massachusetts. I am so heartened to sort of see people and to listen to your poems. And I find myself thinking about how, you know, I'm teaching this semester and there's so much richness maybe. And also, you know, we're asking students to write under such strange circumstances, and having the opportunity to share some of these poems, which are also made under similar circumstances, really excites me, you know, as long as I don't trigger them too much doing that. This is a poem that I wrote while I was here. I've been very conflicted by a number of things, sense of isolation, but also grieving and just a profound sense of this overwhelming general loss and generational loss. And I've had some personal loss as well. And it's tied up just really with, I don't know, the movement that we've made over these months and the cold that we're living in now, and hopefully a thaw that's coming soon. I wrote a poem that was really based on the music I was listening to. I spent most of the summer almost in a cocoon of sound, and walking by the river near my home, well, driving really. But I was listening a lot to the song Riverman, the Andy Bay version. But it's a Nick Drake song as well. And I found myself thinking about how poems speak to poetry, and then how those poems speak to yourself, and how that works out here. So this is Fantasia. Fantasias have that wonderful, free, improvisatory feel to them. It's called Fantasia in a Time of Plague. Went to see the riverman, told him all I could about my plan. He said, "Nah, son, I'm good." You might be surprised to find that he spoke like he was from the hood. But look around. Shade covers every square inch of the ground. Night is the political symbol we're unable to make less literal, a blindness to simple, basic kindness. That's the hood, not the hood. The riverman and all the rivers Milton shouted out to for Lycidas understood this. But he was the myth of a morning kid kidding himself that he cared about king or sin or killing kings. But let me take that back, because he got locked up for that. Poetry is seance and silence and science, holed up in the hood and herring through the wood, part pasture and part hood, a rendition of transition, tradition unplanned, black hoodie pulled back so the ears can see what the eyes don't see, like a river that bends out of sight, but still roars in your head, as the riverman said it would on those sleepless nights when you hear the dead and the living at the river, complicit as kites and rhyming about civil rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. Those rhymes are so fantastic, and those end words, the sleepless nights and the dead and the river and the kites and rhyming and civil rights. And, you know, that also speaks to Camilla Aisha Moon's poem, the ending of which I love so much. It's so beautifully grave. Candlelight for two is a date. I faintly remember those. Candlelight alone is a seance. Forgive me, my dearly departed, for crying out so often, for still needing you so damn much. I'd like to welcome now Grace Schulman, who won the Frost Medal for Lifetime Achievement from the Poetry Society of America. Her 8th book of poems, The Marble Bed, has just been published by Turtle Point Press, and she joins us from Greenwich Village.
Thank you, Alice. Actually, I'm in Long Island.
Oh, you are? Okay, sorry.
And I bring you greetings, but actually I live on Washington Square. And with the pandemic lockdown, I looked out the window and saw no people in Washington Square Park. It seemed obvious to me that the world was coming to an end, and that was too strange for me to imagine it, to believe it. What would it be like, the end of the world? What I could imagine was the world going on as usual, but without us in it. And here's my poem. Gone. Washington Square, 2020. From my window, I see the world without us in it. A vacant park, a silver maple sheltering no reader, a cherry tree dressed like a bride betrayed, her wedding canceled, a dogwood tree whose whites will fall without regretful eyes. No baby strollers, no candy wrappers stuffed in bins, just a sign, no bicycles, and memories of skateboard pirouettes. Around us, death. The numbers spin the mind, fever dreams, the last breath held alone. I had not thought death had undone so many. This park reminds us it was once a field for the unclaimed dead of galloping yellow fever. Construction workers dug up skeletons that had lain for years beneath our footsteps. Death in the hanging elm, a rooted gallows. Now the clear air, pollution-free, is poison for walkers, while trees stand stern, immune. Sad paradox. For comfort, I recall Camille Pissarro would have lingered here. He painted the Paris gardens from a window, having left his island's sprawling shores for tighter scenes. But he gazed at people, matchsticks from above, in ones and twos. Below, the park's unlittered paths are mute. But wait, just now a mournful, prayerful sax, unseen from somewhere, unlooses notes, calls me to the window, and I hear the sounds I can't imagine days without.
Marvelous, Grace, really marvelous. Like an elegy for a sweeter time. I want to introduce Vijay Seshadri, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his collection entitled 3 Sections. He is also the author of the collections Wild Kingdom and The Long Meadow, and a book of prose is forthcoming from Grey Wolf Press in 2022. He is also the editor of a new selection of the poems of T.S. Eliot with a really revelatory introductory essay. I highly recommend it. He joins us from Brooklyn.
Thank you very much, Alice, for including me in this anthology, and it's great to be here with the rest of you reading from it. Hopefully on the other side of all that we've been through, or the beginning of the other side of all that we've been through. The poem of mine that is in the anthology was written on April 5th, 2020, and that's the title. And I was here in New York, shuttling back and forth between Brooklyn and Turtle Bay, right off First Avenue, at a time when the city was losing about 2,000 people a day. And I wrote this poem as a kind of distillation of one of those days, April 5th, 2020. Plague thoughts enter the next phase. I just don't want to talk about it. Okay, let's not. Not the stories, the unbearable stories. You have 5, you don't want any more. You have 15, how did you get so many? Because you live here, because you identify here. Why do you live here? Why do you live anywhere? Identify anywhere. Because of all these the people, these the mysterious people, the people. Run, run, says the plague. Some run out, some run in, some can't run. All are comprehended by the plague. Such a beautiful comprehender, such a beautiful talker, eloquent, intelligent, lucid, precise, analytical, graphs, charts, little and big dots across the world. Such a teacher. About ourselves, we are learning so much from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Vijay. I really admire that reckoning ending. It's so brilliant and marvelous. Yusef, would you be able to join us with a refrain of your poem, which Grace read? We would absolutely love to hear it in your voice.
Unfortunately, I don't think Yusef is with us, or if he is experiencing technical difficulties.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, Grace, for lending your voice to it. And I can't wait for that long poem of his, Requiem, to be published in a book. So now I'll turn it over to you, Sabir, to oversee the Q&A.
Perfect. So we'll now be transitioning to an audience Q&A. For those of you watching on Zoom, please feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat. For those of you watching via the Facebook Live, please feel free to continue to drop comments under the video. And for all of the poets, please feel welcome to turn back on your video screens. And so our first question is from Denise, who says, so many of you are based in New York. Eileen, Shane, Rachel, Eliza, Sally. How did being in the epicenter influence your poems? And for this, I think, so it's not quite a free-for-all, though you should all feel free to interject as you go. Why don't we start off first with Eileen, then go Shane.
I had a unique experience, which was that as somebody who's lived in New York since the 70s, I was in Texas during the pandemic, and so I felt very bereft for New York to be going through a tragedy and me not be in it. You know, there was just a painful separation because my friends were telling me they were hearing sirens out the window, and I didn't really understand it until I got back in July, because my girlfriend and I would go and say, hey, let's have dinner. And we would meet people in cafes out on the street and discovered that July was the first time that many of my friends who live in New York had ever gone out and had dinner in a restaurant publicly, that people were so traumatized by it that we who had not been there were their entree to the outside of their own city. And so for me, it was a real, it was a tragedy for the city itself, and also just a strangeness for me to not be in the midst of it, because I had not, I've been in blackouts and 9/11 and just knew that New York's loss was my loss. And it was indeed, but I didn't get it viscerally. So I had a different experience. It was remote.
Thanks, Eileen.
And Shane?
Sure. Although I don't know that I'm sure I can't say anything especially profound about it. But my family and I moved to New York in 2017. And I don't know how long it takes most people, but I feel like, at least for me, it took me a few years to sort of start to get used to New York. And I think that I was really, I think I'd been falling in love with it since I got here, but really right before the pandemic started, the months leading up to it, I had really been, I guess what my love of New York had really felt. It had started to feel very deep, and there was a way in which when the shutdown started and everything, it was just, I don't know, it's sort of hard to explain. It felt like, everything looked the same, but so much of what I had gotten used to was gone, and every moment outside of the house, particularly in the worst weeks, was an anxious moment. But I felt like I had to leave relatively frequently every few days to get groceries and stuff, and then every moment in the house with regard to the pandemic was anxious in a different way, because you would be worrying, or at least I would be worrying, that when I was out, maybe I had caught something and I didn't know it. And so I don't think my experience was especially unique. It was both frightening, but also I felt a sort of extra effort to try to stay conscious or aware of what life was like before things had gotten really bad, so that I could return to it after.
I think you convey quite a lot atmospherically with that perspective of you and your daughter at that window.
Thank you.
And Rachel, Eliza?
Just to be brief, I think I moved to New York in 2003, and so I think I'm still really gripped by what I experienced last spring, and to think that now we're coming toward spring again, and some of us are being vaccinated, but there are still many of us who are not. And the feeling of the spring, how it felt, and then also maybe a week and a half or so after things really shut down here in New York, I had COVID, and it was just terrifying. And I think I'm probably still traumatized from that experience, but also caring for loved ones and just not having any reference, and just keeping vigil, and the silence in the city, and yet this kind of like defensiveness for the city, and to watch this arc, which, we're talking about COVID, but I also want to include during this time all of the Black Lives Matter protests. So the days were, they were studded with sirens and helicopters above. And I suddenly thought, if I live long enough, this will be this time that I'll try to describe to someone else and what it felt like. But I think I'm carrying quite a bit still in my body.
Thanks for
Sally?
that. Thank you for that testimony, Rachel.
Then Sally, if you'd like to answer too.
Oh, thank you. I've actually, so I've lived in New York on and off since 2013, but I actually left New York a few years ago. And during this pandemic, I've been in Las Vegas, kind of seeing, COVID blow up in New York, but I was actually the week before it blew up, I was in New York. So I remember that time very, very clearly, because I think I had been doing a talk, and I just remembered the first thought I had with like exiting Grand Central was how nobody had masks on, and I was scared. But yeah, I mean, I've also heard it secondhand from friends, like the experience of just hearing the sirens every day, and this feeling of like hopelessness and just not knowing like when something is going to end. And I think it's imprinted as like this collective memory, and also being someone from Wuhan, or not from Wuhan, actually, I was born there, but like I remembered being hyper conscious of that impact on a city ever since January when it struck Wuhan, and my entire family being really hyper conscious of what was going on with this pandemic and with this virus since then. My grandmother, for example, has not left her house since for over a year now, since January of last year. She has not left the house. So I feel like people from Wuhan have really like I don't know, just like internalized this experience of COVID. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd be curious, though this isn't quite a customer question, but just a personal one, to like decenter New York a bit. So Rowan, if you'd like to speak to it, and I believe Eliza, you're also outside of the city as well, if you'd like to speak to your own experiences.
Well, I'm a born and raised New Yorker, and I was actually, I live in New York. My time during the pandemic is strange in this sense because I've been in Williamstown full time since March 13th, which is Friday the 13th, which is that day that basically New York changed. And that was also the day that my grandmother passed away. She was 93 and already kind of convalescing and everything like that. So I find myself in exile in a way, which is strange, but also it's good for the work, right? I mean, the act of the mind, search of that which will suffice. And right now, finding sufficiency is writing poems and trying to commune and make some music like Sasha's doing, which I think is so great, and finding some way to connect. So I'm someone who's extirpated from New York, but also my wife's from Barcelona. Half my family is from Barcelona and thereabouts. And so we've seen the pandemic and kind of lived it nightly, both watching New York and Barcelona from this little nest in the Berkshires. It's been fraught and strange, and kind of modeling for making art, I find, because it's healthy for the imagination, and there's something kind of tragic about that. But that's the life of the artist. So
Rowan, Maureen McLean, who has a wonderful poem in the book, has mentioned in the chat that you and Sasha Alexander Himan have both brought up music. She says Rowan's poems suffused with it, wondering how or whether they and the other poets found themselves listening differently during these past months, thinking too of the sirenscape of New York City last spring, as well as music, protests, etc. So just wondering, Sasha, whether you want to say anything about that, how or whether you and other poets found themselves listening differently.
I think, yes, listening differently and generally paying more attention, because in some ways there are fewer things to pay attention to. That is, we are focused in this obsessive way. And it isn't just COVID, but everything that was happening in this country. And so it is a kind of a plague unto itself, where it is very difficult for one, poet or not, to have thoughts that are not infected by what is going on, right? And I mean, daily, not generally. And of course, it is good to pay attention to what is going on. It's important to do what many of us have done and write about things. But at the same time, this space in which one experiences the world at a sort of basic material level, as sounds, for instance, it becomes more important in some ways. I have not debated this with myself before I decided to delve into this, but the week of March 13th, it was Friday, I bought an electric guitar. I hadn't played music in decades, and I somehow recognized that I'm going to want to be obsessive about sounds and music. And I work in language, I worked for decades, but I hadn't written poetry also for a very long time. But it is the sounds, but also paying attention to the smallest things, because the smallest things still matter. That our lives are still made of the multitude of details that constitute a human life. And so it is not an escape, but rather finding a way to have agency, to have some kind of agency in the world, in a country, in a situation which it's very hard to change outcomes, because the processes and catastrophes are so huge that despite our best intentions, it's very difficult to change the direction and the outcome. And so I recognized after months of doing this that what I was doing was healing, because I would be making something, a track or a poem or chapter in my novel, and my constant fear was that it would fall apart, that the whole thing would crash, and then it wouldn't. And there was something about this that, however hopeless and in the large picture in some ways meaningless those acts were, I had agency, I was not helpless. And this all in a building, I have my office where I'm now, is in a 7-story building in Princeton, and there's no one here ever except for me. It's like, you know, Zombie Land Part 4. And so just making stuff is what saved my mind, I think.
You know, Alexander, that summons up to me Rick Barrett's poems, the prose poems in the book. When you say paying attention to particulars and the obsessiveness of that, and the salvational aspect of the obsessive nature of that. And one of his prose poems, it's very short, I'll read it. During the pandemic, I knew each neighbor by one thing: the neighbor above, the baby; the neighbors below, the dog; someone down the hall, fried fish; someone else down the hall, the opera when their door opened. I made my rooms quieter by standing in the middle of each one, my mind moving intently like an old man in slippers. I wondered what one thing the neighbors would know me by, what truth an inadvertence could betray.
Yeah, that's lovely. I think it's also, I mean, what I also realized I was doing is making stuff, and this is what we're all doing really, it presupposes a future in which people will get to it. and
Yeah.
this is the future. And so, you know, this very event means in some ways that we have made it this far. And that some people will find that, I don't know, compelling, I suppose.
Thank you very much. You were also in Berlin for some of this too.
I was, yes. And Princeton is desolate as the students were dismissed. And so I haven't been in a restaurant since March of last year. And then I spent a month in Berlin, and just the shock of people being on the street and parks full of people. It was a light lockdown, so the stores were open. I went into a store to buy shoes. That hasn't happened.
Yeah. Okay, well.
It was strange. Everything becomes strange. I think that's another aspect of this. This is the effect of defamiliarization, if you wish, or estrangement.
Right.
In the you know, literary theory sense, suddenly the most banal things are strange. Oh, look, a person's walking down the street. You know.
Well, I wonder, Grace, did you want to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to add.
Grace, you have to unmute.
Oh, I think you are unmuted, Grace. If you wouldn't mind just speaking up a little, please.
Oh, I just wanted to add a response to Maureen's comment. I left Washington Square after hearing sirens and street fires. From my window, I could see a police car in flames. A man fell to the ground, helicopter noise. The noise was too much. And I came out here to the sea, to the shore, and a very odd thing happened. I see Miles Davis in every egret, leaning with his horn. I hear Sonny Rollins in the waves. I hear Ben Webster on the shore. Jazz has filled my mind with sound to replace the terrible cacophony that I heard on the streets.
And it's jazz in your memory, Grace.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful. That's great.
There's the sax in the last stanza of the poem I read, but here it's everywhere. I can hear it everywhere. In my memory, also on YouTube, on CDs, constantly playing Sonny Rollins. And I just heard today Howard Johnson died, who added the tuba to his jazz band, which is marvelous. And I can't get enough of it. And I'm sure it is the replacement, the dulling out of city sound.
Right.
Unbearable.
That you don't hear from your window anymore.
That's
Well, I wonder, Sabir, should I end with the last 8 lines of Julia Alvarez's poem, the poem that launches the anthology?
Sure, yes, though I think if you're all amenable to it, I'll slip in one last question for Eliza and Vijay as we...
Sure, do that now.
Yeah, and then this question is from Carson, who asks, how did the pandemic change your sense of self? Did having to spend so much time in your own head change how you see yourself or how you understand yourself? Then why don't we begin with Eliza?
Oh, that's a great, easy little question. Like, what have I been baking? Like sourdough and self-hatred over here? No, I have not baked one thing, not one. So that's I can't do that. How did it change my sense of self? Okay, so my salvation during this time has been that I get to be a reporter. So I get to vanish into that work and go out and tell other people's stories. When I am left to my own devices, and this is in COVID or not, I am prone to a certain kind of darkness that's not very helpful to anyone. and self-scrutiny. So how did it change my sense of self? Okay, the one true thing is that in the beginning of this, I was extremely judgmental of how other people, I would be like, oh, that's the wrong kind of mask. Like I just found myself obsessively judging. And then I realized I was doing that because I was terrified and I didn't have any answers. And it was easier to pretend to myself that I knew what everyone should be doing than the fact that I knew nothing at all. So once I saw the fear underneath that judgment, it has helped me, I hope, drop judgment more everywhere. Like not totally, but I think I'm a less judgmental person, I'm hoping. And that's a big change. So that's about what I've got.
Wow. Thank you for your candor. That's great. All right, well, I'm going to end with the last lines of Julia Alvarez's poem. How will this pandemic affect poetry? Will poems be the only safe spaces where we can gather together, enter their immense silences, see snakes slithering inside sestinas, listen to nightingales singing on the boughs of odes? Hark, a lark in the terza rima, a hawk in a haiku. What if only poetry will see us through? What if this poem is the vaccine already working inside you? So thank you all so very much. And thank you, Sabir. And good luck to us all in the days ahead. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
Thanks, Sabir.
Thank you. Bye.